Under the long shadow of Russia, Britain's government is accused of ignoring Moscow's attempts to undermine its security and democracy. So, how should the UK respond to these threats? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The UK is considering tighter security laws after an intelligence report on Russian interference. A parliamentary committee says no one in government wanted to know about Moscow's attempts to interfere in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the Brexit vote 2 years later. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has rejected the assessment, while the Kremlin called it Russo-phobia. But the allegations are raising questions about the extent of Russian influence on British society. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Sevodnya in London.
In the shadows of Britain's democratic process and its economy, the threat of interference from Russia looms large.
Russia poses an all-encompassing security threat, which is fueled by paranoia about the West and a desire to be seen as a resurgent great power. It carries out malicious cyber activity in order to assert itself aggressively, for example, by attempting to interfere in other countries' elections and by pre-positioning itself on other countries' critical national infrastructure.
The warning signs were there. The Scottish independence referendum in 2014, the first post-Soviet interference in a Western democratic election. But it raised little curiosity from the government. This long-awaited report paints a picture of a political system rife with complacency when it came to the issue of Russian attempts at interference. Britain's democratic processes were at stake, as was its national security. So the question remains, why did governments take so long to tackle them?
There is a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin who are now very well integrated into both UK business, political and social scene in what has been referred to as Londongrad. Yet few, if any, questions have been asked regarding the provenance of considerable wealth.
It was the government's failure to look into possible Russian meddling in the 2016 Brexit referendum that sparked the investigation by MPs. No evidence of interference has been found, but the lack of curiosity to examine that raised alarm in the report. After the Brexit vote, it was the turn of the US. In the 2016 presidential election, US intelligence agencies concluded that Russia had been behind cyber attacks on the Democratic Party to help the eventual winner, Donald Trump. It was a wake-up call that turned into an uproar after the attempted murder of former double agent Sergei Skripal on British soil with a Soviet-developed nerve agent. Russia denied it was to blame, but it plunged UK-Russian relations to a low not seen since the Cold War. But it is the undermining of British institutions that is at the heart of this storm. The UK will have to overhaul its previous approach if it is to have a chance of tackling this new normal. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
Let's bring in our panel in London. We have Andrew Foxall. He's the director of the Russia and Eurasia Studies Centre at the Henry Jackson Society. In Moscow, Dmitry Babich, a political analyst at the news media company Rossiya Sevodnya. And in Washington, D.C., we have Nina Jankowicz. She's a disinformation fellow at the Wilson Center and author of the book How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News and the Future of Conflict. I want to welcome you all to the show. Let's begin in London with Andrew Foxall. I read the report. Almost every single paragraph is quite damning about the British government and its complacency and just simple lack of interest when it came to tackling the Russian threat. They seemingly were outmaneuvered, outgunned and outplayed almost all the time. Is this a threat that the British government simply didn't think was serious?
Well, it's hard to disagree really with what you've just said. The successive British governments, and I think that's an important point and one worth making early, successive British governments demonstrated short-sightedness and naivety, seemingly where the threat or the challenge posed by Vladimir Putin's Russia is concerned, particularly as it relates to the UK. And I think, again, that's a point worth making, is that this is a threat that the report relates to the threat posed by Russia to the United Kingdom. And the time period that the report concerns itself with is 2014 onwards. This is, of course, itself 8 years, best part of a decade after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. It's 6 years after Russia's illegal war with Georgia and its occupation since then of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's obviously a number of years after Russia's conduct in Chechnya, its persecution of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and dismemberment of the Yukos oil company, as a result of which a number of high-profile Russian individuals moved to the United Kingdom and sought political asylum here. So really, the true nature of the Russian regime ought to have been obvious to London, if no other Western capital, in 2014, and yet, as the report makes clear, successive British governments, as I say, and as you said earlier, demonstrated short-sightedness and naivety where the threat posed by Russia is concerned. It is staggering, and as you say, sort of concern drips almost from every page of the report.
But Andrew, let's be absolutely honest here. One of the things that the report doesn't make clear, but all of the writing around the report makes clear, is that perhaps successive Conservative governments were far too close to key Russian players and they simply weren't investigating for that reason.
Yes, I mean, I would just, I suppose, broaden out your comment. There's a focus obviously on successive Conservative governments here, but the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had their own issues with the Kremlin and with Russia. But successive Conservative governments, as you said, have their issues with Russian money, and I think it's worthwhile, just almost taking a step back and looking at how this report came into being. So, it's 5 years now since the Intelligence and Security Committee originally announced that it wanted to conduct an inquiry into Russian interference in the United Kingdom. It's 2 years since that inquiry began, after, foot dragging by both David Cameron and Theresa May when they were prime ministers. It's 18 months since the report that resulted from that inquiry was sent to Number 10, and 9 months since Boris Johnson, as he then became prime minister, attempted to sit on it. So there's a much broader context to this issue than simply the report itself. Now, the report doesn't contain any smoking guns of the sort that I think a lot of people were hoping for. The report doesn't concern itself, or rather, the redacted version of the report doesn't concern itself with details about prominent Russians giving money, for example, to UK political parties or UK political movements, or the closeness and proximity of UK political figures to prominent Russian individuals. So it doesn't deal with the broader context that I think a lot of people were hoping for. But it doesn't need to, because what we know about Russia, the threat that Russia poses and the nature of the threat is in itself damning enough. And in spite of that, successive governments did very little to combat it.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow. The Russians seem to be playing this down. They're calling it Russo-phobia. They're saying that this is simply stereotyping, that the Russians had nothing to do with interference in UK politics at all. Here is a massive report that suggests that they did. What's the thinking behind that?
I don't know why you are saying that, because I also read the report, and I think the report is a scandal. Because let me quote you what they just wrote about the so-called Russian interference in the Brexit referendum. I'm quoting: "The written evidence provided to us appeared to suggest that Her Majesty's government had not seen or sought evidence of successful interference in UK democratic process or any activity that has had a material impact on an election, for example, on influencing the election's results." So what are we talking about? The report does not provide any facts, any evidence of Russia's involvement in the referendum in 2016 or in the Scottish referendum of 2014. Let me tell you honestly, no one in Russia, almost no one knows about the problem of Scottish nationalism or about any contradictions between the English and the Scots. It's not a matter that is of concern to Russians. So I think that it's just preposterous to say that, as Andrew just said, we don't need facts. What we know about Russia is enough. This is not legal language. This is not worthy of the British Parliament. And also conclusions that this report makes are really dangerous for British society because, in fact, the report suggests that the British special services and not just the government departments, not just the Electoral Commission, should be now supervising and protecting the British election. This is really dangerous, and the report says that there is always concern about special services protecting elections or voting anywhere. And this is exactly the case in Britain.
Let's bring in Nina Jankowicz in Washington, D.C. I see you shaking your head there at some of the comments that Dmitry Babich made in Moscow. Do you believe that Russia has a case to answer for?
Listen, just because an investigation wasn't conducted in the United Kingdom does not mean that there is not evidence of Russian interference, not only in the United Kingdom, but across Central and Eastern Europe for the past decade plus, and here in the United States. We know, for instance, thanks to the advertisements released by House Democrats in May of 2018 relating to the U.S. election, that some of those advertisements purchased by the Internet Research Agency, headed up by oligarch Prigozhin in Russia, were targeting the United Kingdom with anti-immigration messages before the Brexit referendum. There is open source evidence of this interference, and the fact that Mr. Babich is suggesting that just because an investigation did not happen, which the report is damning in its conclusions regarding that, that doesn't mean there isn't evidence for this long-term interference. I've looked at this interference across, again, Central and Eastern Europe, in Estonia in 2007, in Georgia in 2008, in Poland, in Czech Republic, and certainly in Ukraine. Russia uses disinformation and influence as a political tool. This is a well-established fact. And the fact that Mr. Babich, who has written, I should add, for RT and Sputnik before, Agents of Russian Propaganda, is trying to push this narrative on us today is not surprising to me.
You are an agent of American propaganda.
Well, Dmitry, why don't
Andrew Jackson is well known, okay.
No, please answer. I'm looking forward to your response.
Yeah, I'm ready to answer. Well, if we are talking about the so-called Russian interference in British or American elections, Mueller Commission has worked for 2.5 years. The American media was full of fake reports about Russia's involvement. And what was the conclusion? The Mueller Committee concluded that, I'm quoting, there was no collusion between Mr. Trump's campaign and Russia. In this case, why is this report not based on any evidence? The authors of the report say that we have not been provided with any evidence from the British Special Services. That's very strange. So what is this report based on if the British Special Services did not provide facts? As for cases of British or American interference in foreign elections, there are plenty of them. The United States openly acknowledged it and prided itself on interfering in Boris Yeltsin's election in 1996 in Russia. We all remember, Andrew has cited Russia's operations in Ukraine. Well, it's 17 years since the UK and the United States illegally invaded Iraq based on fake evidence. As for the accusations which this report takes for granted, for example, the Salisbury affair, it's very strange that 4 months after Petrov and Bashirov left the UK, the vial that they were supposed to bring to Salisbury poisoned and killed one person and badly poisoned another person in a different city inside the UK. How could it happen 4 months after they left the UK? This is really something that should have given some food for thoughts for this commission. But unfortunately, these facts are not examined. They are not taken for serious information. And we just report the same thing all the time. Russia interferes. Russia gets involved. Russia destroys. Russia is called a hostile country in this report. Well, this is a very aggressive move. I cannot imagine our parliament calling Britain an aggressive or hostile country. We are not calling the United States hostile country, despite all their actions against us. So you can see from this report who is really aggressive. And this
Nina, I'm going to come to you in just a second. Dmitry, we are running out of time, and I do want to get to everybody.
Very questionable from a legal point of view.
I want to get to everybody.
I will just 10 seconds. Okay, just 10 seconds. In this report calls to investigate everyone connected to Putin. And somehow it suggests that any people connected to the head of Russian state, even if they're involved in charity activities in the UK, are somehow suspect. Imagine what would happen if the Russian parliamentarians or the Russian press wrote that anyone connected to Boris Johnson should be suspect. That's absolutely wrong from a legal point of view. And to say that Boris Johnson or the conservative governments were pro-Russian is a mockery of logic, because Boris Johnson has been openly hostile to Russia. He called for demonstrations near the Russian embassy when the Salisbury affair occurred. So
Dmitry, thank you for that. We will come back to you. We will come back to you, Dmitry. We will. And Nina, I'm going to come back to you in just a second. But Andrew Foxall in London, perhaps the bigger question here is not that countries interfere in other countries' affairs. I mean, let's face it, the Americans and the Brits, one of the most famous cases, the 53 coup in Iran, backed by the CIA and the British. You know, this does happen. It's just part and parcel of international affairs. This is about Britain's own failures within its own security establishment, with its own government itself, and not taking this seriously. I mean, it's not about the Russians. The Russians are going to interfere, as do the British, as do the Americans, in other people's affairs. This is about a failure on the British front, surely.
I mean, first of all, I would welcome the opportunity to respond to what Dmitry has said, but I mean, I just don't see that it's really worth our time. I would reject the moral equivalence that he's attempted to draw between what the UK and the US do and what Russia does, and I'll leave it at that. I think you're right, however, in that much of the focus and much of the analysis that's been done of the report since it was released yesterday has focused on Russia. Whereas actually, to my mind, the greatest story is about the United Kingdom and how successive UK governments failed in their basic right or role to protect UK citizens by intentionally or unintentionally, wittingly or unwittingly, by omission or on purpose, failed to take seriously the threat posed by a hostile state, whether that's Russia or anybody else, to our democratic processes. And that's the key thing that comes out of this, to my mind. The report, you know, beyond the bland language used, the report does portray a clear narrative that Russia has attempted to undertake influence operations. It's attempted to penetrate our institutions and it attempted to undermine our processes. And it's quite clear about that. The report, however, is also clear that successive governments basically did nothing about this. But not only that, they purposely did nothing about this. Dmitry, Mr. Babich was quite right, and he said, you know, it was a scandal that the report says that no successful evidence had been forthcoming because of, owing to, or due to Russian interference in the 2016 EU referendum. I make that point, you know, not with any party political or other persuasion around Brexit. But the biggest scandal is that the government sought not to ask that question. You know, and the key point of the government's mantra about no successful evidence of Russian interference, the real question is whether there's any evidence, successful or otherwise, of Russian interference. The report, to my mind, because of its scope and a number of other things, begs more questions than it provides answers for.
Nina Jankowicz in Washington, D.C. Surely this is just a case of chickens coming home to roost. I mean, the Americans have interfered in other people's affairs for a very long time, and now the Russians are doing it, and they seemingly seem to be very good at it, that you're putting your, you know, arms up in the air and saying this is unfair.
Like Drew, I really reject the moral equivalence of those statements. Of course, there are covert efforts of interference that every nation does. What we're talking about here, what Russia has done and become very successful at, is efforts of overt interference in the civilian sphere. They are posing as Americans, as Brits, in order to influence our democratic discourse, in order to turn us against one another. That is not the sort of value that the United States or Great Britain stands for. We stand for openness and transparency. And in those overt activities, that is not something we would ever seek to do. And to respond to Mr. Babich's point about the Russian Federation, not calling out the United States or Great Britain, there's an undesirable foreign organizations law in Russian Federation that calls out specifically organizations seeking to do research and support democratic activists around the country that are, headquartered here in America, in the UK. I would say that's a fairly aggressive action, not to mention the aggressive military actions that Russia has taken. The informational war is only part of Russia's foreign policy. This costs lives in countries like Ukraine and Georgia, and I think we would be foolhardy to ignore that. Now, I do agree with Drew in the case that, the UK government needs to do more. It's very interesting for me in the report to read, laudatory comments about the United States response, because our intelligence community has called these efforts out. Of course, some of this is being undermined by rhetoric that's coming from politicians from the White House in particular. What we all need to do, and this is where I really agree with the report, is the West needs to band together and cooperate with regards to its countering not only of disinformation coming from Russia or adversarial nations like China. We need to call out disinformation no matter its vector, whether it is coming from our domestic politicians or foreign vectors as well, because ultimately it is a threat to democracy and participation in the democratic process.
Disinformation is a very good word. And now, very quickly, before we run out of time, and I do want to ask you all of this, if you can try and keep your answers short. Let's begin with Andrew. Andrew, disinformation, it's being sent via social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter. These things aren't policing themselves. This is a big problem for governments. Very quickly, do you think that social media has a role and a responsibility here as well?
It certainly does. And in that respect, I agree with Nina, and she, far more than I, is better placed to answer this question, given that she has just written a book on this very topic. But this goes back to a point that I just made. An awful lot of the conclusions that result from the report actually relate to what the West and the UK can do to better protect itself than actually relate to what Russia is doing. The conclusions, to my mind, are in a sense too little and scandalously too late.
Dmitry, just very, very quickly, because we are running out of time, but I do want you to say, is social media a concern for you when it comes to disinformation, both in Russia and in other parts of the world?
Very quickly, just 3 facts. I think social media is very important and it should be free, period. On disinformation, I think the biggest case of disinformation was publications in the Western press about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before the invasion of 2003. One fact on undesirable organizations that Nina described, well, the United States adopted the law on foreign agents 60 years earlier than Russia, and then the United States made scandals about the law which was copied from the American legislation in Russia. And third, the most scandalous thing about this report, parliamentary report in Britain is, I quote, "We have not been provided with any post-referendum assessments of Russian attempts at interference." This is a quote from the report, which means that the Lords or the parliamentarians
Dmitry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Nina
from their
Jankowicz, I want to ask you that same question. I want to ask you that same question. Social media has a responsibility here.
Absolutely, social media companies have a responsibility. They have been doing too little, too late. The vectors by which disinformation travels faster and farther are provided through social media. But not only that, social media allows bad actors, foreign or domestic, to target the very audiences that are going to be most vulnerable to the narratives that they're trying to peddle. And that's what's most dangerous about them, the business model. So we absolutely need some regulation. I am not, calling for governments or the social media companies themselves to play whack-a-troll or act as censors, but we do need transparency and oversight of this new technology because it is causing real world harm.
A fascinating discussion. Let me thank all our guests, Andrew Foxall, Nina Jankowicz and Dmitry Babich. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.